You wake up each morning with a feeling that something is not right. There is this nagging sense in your heart, this quiet unrest that follows you through your daily routine. You go through the motions of life, checking off your responsibilities, but deep inside there is a voice whispering that you are missing something crucial. You have felt it during those quiet moments before sleep, when the noise of the world finally fades and you are left alone with your thoughts. There is something God is trying to tell you, but you keep pushing it aside, drowning it out with distractions, with busyness, with anything that keeps you from having to listen. Saint Ignatius of Loyola knew this feeling intimately, and he discovered that when we ignore these divine whispers, we miss the very guidance our souls desperately need. What if that restlessness you feel is not anxiety, but invitation? What if that persistent sense that something needs to change in your life is actually God trying to warn you about the path you are on? The truth that Ignatius discovered during his own spiritual transformation is both startling and liberating. God is constantly speaking to us, constantly guiding us, constantly warning us when we are drifting away from our true purpose. But here is what most people never realize about these divine communications. They do not usually come as dramatic visions or booming voices from heaven. Instead, they arrive as subtle movements in our hearts, as persistent thoughts that will not leave us alone, as circumstances that keep repeating until we finally pay attention. Ignatius called this the movement of spirits within our souls, and he developed an entire spiritual science around learning to recognize and respond to these interior motions. When God wants to warn you about something, the message often arrives disguised as an uncomfortable feeling that will not go away. Think about the last time you felt truly at peace about a decision you made. Remember that sense of rightness, that quiet joy that settled in your heart when you knew you were aligned with God's will. Now contrast that with those decisions that left you feeling empty or restless, even when they seemed logical or beneficial from a worldly perspective. This is the language God uses to guide and warn us. Ignatius discovered that our emotions and interior movements are not random or meaningless. They are actually sophisticated communication systems through which the divine speaks directly to our hearts. When we learn to read these interior signs correctly, we begin to understand that God has been trying to get our attention far longer than we ever realized. The reason so many of us miss these divine warnings is that we live in a culture that has taught us to distrust our deeper feelings and to prioritize external achievements over interior wisdom. We have been conditioned to believe that spiritual guidance is either non-existent or reserved for specially chosen individuals. But Ignatius revolutionized this understanding by demonstrating that every person, regardless of their background or education, has direct access to divine communication through their own hearts. The problem is not that God is not speaking. The problem is that we have forgotten how to listen. We have become so accustomed to the noise of modern life that we can no longer hear the gentle voice that has been trying to guide us all along. When Ignatius lay wounded in his family castle, forced into a period of physical stillness that he initially resented, he began to notice something remarkable about his thoughts and feelings. When he fantasized about worldly achievements and romantic conquests, he felt excited in the moment but empty afterward. When he imagined himself serving God and following the examples of the saints, he felt a deeper, more lasting joy that stayed with him long after the thoughts had passed. This observation became the foundation of his entire spiritual system. He realized that God communicates with us through the quality and lasting effects of our interior experiences. The feelings that come from God leave us with peace, hope, and authentic joy. The impulses that lead us away from God might provide temporary excitement, but ultimately leave us feeling hollow and restless. This discovery has profound implications for how we navigate the major and minor decisions of our lives. Every choice we face, from the career we pursue to the relationships we invest in, from the way we spend our free time to the values we prioritize, generates different movements in our hearts. God is constantly warning us through these interior responses when we are heading in directions that will ultimately leave us unfulfilled. The persistent anxiety you feel about that job that pays well but drains your soul is not just stress. It might be God warning you that this path is not leading you toward your true purpose. The uneasiness you feel in certain relationships is not necessarily a character flaw in yourself. It could be divine guidance helping you recognize connections that are not healthy for your spiritual growth. Let me pause here and speak directly to your heart about something that might be happening in your life right now. Have you been experiencing a growing sense that you are not living as authentically as you could be? That feeling when you look in the mirror and realize you have been playing a role rather than being your true self? When you go to sleep at night, does your heart whisper that there is more to life than what you are currently experiencing? I want you to know that this restlessness is not a sign that something is wrong with you. According to Ignatian spirituality, this discomfort might be one of the most sacred experiences you can have. It is God's way of warning you that you are settling for less than the abundant life you were created to live. If you are feeling this way right now, I invite you to share it in the comments. You can simply write, "I feel God calling me to something more." And if you feel comfortable, briefly share what area of your life feels like it needs God's guidance. Your comment could be exactly what someone else needs to read today, to recognize that they are not alone in sensing God's invitation to deeper authenticity. Sometimes acknowledging these divine stirrings is the first step toward the transformation our hearts have been longing for. The genius of Ignatian spirituality lies in its practical approach to recognizing divine communication in the midst of ordinary life. Ignatius did not retreat from the world to find God. Instead, he developed methods for finding God in all things, including the routine moments and everyday decisions that make up most of our existence. He taught that God is present and active in every circumstance, constantly offering guidance to those who learn to pay attention. This means that the warning God might be trying to give you could be hidden in the most ordinary aspects of your current situation. The difficulty you are having with your supervisor might be pointing you toward a career change that aligns better with your gifts. The recurring conflicts in your family relationships might be inviting you to examine patterns that need healing. The books that keep catching your attention, or the conversations that spark unexpected interest, might be God's way of leading you toward new growth. One of the most important insights Ignatius offers is that divine warnings often arrive disguised as invitations rather than threats. When God warns us about the path we are on, it is not usually to frighten or condemn us. Instead, it is to redirect us towards something better. The restlessness you feel in your current situation is not punishment for making wrong choices. It is love calling you toward choices that will bring you greater fulfillment and allow you to contribute more authentically to the world around you. This reframe changes everything about how we respond to uncomfortable feelings and challenging circumstances. Instead of seeing difficulties as problems to be solved or eliminated, we begin to recognize them as potential messages from a loving God who wants us to experience the fullness of life we were created for. Ignatius learned through painful experience that ignoring divine warnings leads to increasingly serious consequences. When we consistently push aside the interior movements that are trying to guide us, we find ourselves more and more disconnected from our authentic selves and our true purpose. The anxiety intensifies. The sense of emptiness grows. The feeling that we are living someone else's life becomes overwhelming. But here is the hope that Ignatius discovered, and that he wants to share with every person who feels trapped by their circumstances. It is never too late to start listening. No matter how far we have drifted from God's intended path for our lives, the divine voice is still speaking, still calling, still offering guidance toward healing and restoration. The challenge for most of us is learning to distinguish between the voice of God and the many other voices that compete for our attention. Ignatius identified specific characteristics that help us recognize authentic divine communication. God's voice brings peace even when it calls us to difficult changes. It generates hope even when it points out areas that need transformation. It produces love even when it requires sacrifice. In contrast, the voice of discouragement, fear, and condemnation does not come from God, even when it might seem to be motivated by religious concerns. The enemy of our souls, as Ignatius called the force that opposes our spiritual growth, often disguises harmful impulses as spiritual insights. Learning to discern between these different interior movements becomes one of the most important skills we can develop as human beings seeking to live according to God's will. This process of spiritual discernment that Ignatius developed is not a mysterious art reserved for advanced mystics. It is a practical skill that anyone can learn and apply to their daily life. It begins with simply paying attention to what is happening in your heart throughout the day. When you feel energized and alive, take note of what triggered those feelings. When you feel drained or discouraged, examine what preceded those emotions. Over time, patterns will emerge that help you recognize which activities, relationships, and choices consistently lead you toward God, and which ones lead you away. This awareness becomes a form of ongoing divine guidance that can transform every aspect of your life. The practice that Ignatius is most famous for developing, the daily exam, is specifically designed to help us recognize divine communication in the midst of ordinary life. This simple prayer practice involves setting aside a few minutes each day to review your recent experiences and notice where you felt God's presence most strongly and where you felt most disconnected from the divine. Through this regular reflection, you begin to see patterns in how God communicates with you personally. You start to recognize your own unique spiritual language, the specific ways that divine warnings and invitations tend to arrive in your life. Some people receive guidance primarily through their emotions. Others notice it in their physical sensations or energy levels. Still others see it in the circumstances and opportunities that present themselves. The key is learning to pay attention to your own interior experience, with the expectation that God is actively involved in your life. What makes Ignatian spirituality so revolutionary is its insistence that this kind of intimate divine relationship is available to everyone, not just to priests or nuns or people who have dramatic conversion experiences. Ignatius himself was a worldly soldier with no particular religious background when he began to notice God speaking through his thoughts and feelings. His transformation happened gradually, through consistent attention to the movements of his own heart and a willingness to follow where that guidance led him. This means that wherever you are right now in your spiritual journey, whatever mistakes you might have made or whatever distance you might feel from God, you have the same capacity for divine communication that transformed Ignatius from an ambitious young man into one of the most influential spiritual teachers in Christian history. The practical implications of this understanding extend into every area of human life. When you are trying to decide whether to take a new job, Ignatian discernment involves more than just weighing the practical advantages and disadvantages. It includes paying attention to how you feel when you imagine yourself in that position. Do you feel energized and excited about the contribution you could make? Do you sense that this opportunity would allow you to use your gifts more fully? Or do you feel a subtle dread, a sense that this choice would require you to compromise important values or neglect aspects of your life that bring you joy? These interior responses are not just emotional reactions to be ignored or suppressed. According to Ignatian spirituality, they are data from God about whether this particular choice aligns with the divine plan for your life. The same principle applies to relationships. When you spend time with certain people, do you consistently feel more yourself, more connected to your best intentions, more inspired to grow and contribute positively to the world? Or do you find yourself becoming someone you do not like very much, caught up in gossip or negativity, or behaviors that leave you feeling ashamed? Ignatius teaches that God guides us toward relationships that help us become more loving, more authentic, more generous versions of ourselves. The persistent discomfort you might feel in relationships that seem fine on the surface could be divine guidance helping you recognize connections that are not ultimately healthy for your spiritual development. This same discernment process can be applied to the way you spend your free time, the entertainment you choose, the causes you support, and even the thoughts you entertain in your private moments. Ignatius believed that God cares about every aspect of our lives and is constantly offering guidance about choices that will lead us toward greater fulfillment and more authentic service to others. The feeling of emptiness you experience after spending hours on social media might be God warning you that this activity is not nourishing your soul. The sense of purpose you feel when you volunteer for a particular cause might be divine confirmation that this is one way you are meant to contribute to the healing of the world. One of the most common ways that God tries to warn us, according to Ignatian teaching, is through a growing awareness that we are living according to someone else's expectations, rather than our own authentic calling. Many people spend years or even decades pursuing goals that were set for them by their families, their culture, or their own younger selves without ever stopping to ask whether these objectives still align with who they have become and what they truly value. The anxiety and depression that so many people experience in modern life might often be God's way of warning us that we are investing our lives in pursuits that do not reflect our deepest identity and purpose. This does not mean that every difficulty or challenge in life is a sign that we are on the wrong path. Ignatius distinguished between different types of struggle. Some difficulties arise because we are growing and being stretched beyond our comfort zones in ways that are ultimately beneficial. These challenges often come with an underlying sense of rightness and purpose, even when they are demanding or uncomfortable. Other struggles persist because we are trying to force ourselves into situations that are fundamentally incompatible with who God created us to be. These difficulties tend to generate ongoing anxiety, resentment, or a sense of being trapped. Learning to distinguish between these different types of challenge is crucial for anyone who wants to live according to divine guidance. The process of learning to hear and respond to divine warnings requires both courage and patience. It takes courage because God's guidance often calls us to make changes that seem risky from a worldly perspective. It takes patience because learning to distinguish between authentic divine communication and our own fears, desires, and projections is a skill that develops over time through practice and experience. Many people give up on this process too quickly because they expect dramatic clarity or immediate results. But Ignatius teaches that divine guidance usually unfolds gradually, through a series of small steps and gentle corrections rather than through sudden revelations. If these reflections on divine communication have stirred something in your heart, I want to encourage you to begin or deepen your own practice of spiritual attention. Start by setting aside just 5 minutes at the end of each day to ask yourself where you felt most alive and where you felt most disconnected from your authentic self during the past 24 hours. Notice what activities, conversations, and experiences consistently leave you feeling energized and hopeful. Pay attention to what drains your energy or leaves you feeling empty. Over time, these observations will begin to reveal patterns that can guide your decisions and help you recognize when God might be trying to get your attention about something important. Remember that this process is not about achieving perfection or never making mistakes. It is about developing a more intimate relationship with the God who loves you enough to guide you toward the life you were created to live. Ignatius himself made many errors in judgment as he learned to follow divine guidance. What mattered was not that he got everything right immediately, but that he remained open to correction and continued to pay attention to how God was speaking through his experiences. The same patience and compassion that God showed to Ignatius throughout his journey of spiritual growth is available to you as you learn to recognize and respond to divine communication in your own life. The ultimate goal of Ignatian spirituality is not to escape from the world, but to find God more fully present within all of your ordinary experiences. When you learn to recognize divine warnings and guidance, every aspect of your life becomes an opportunity for deeper spiritual growth and more authentic service. Your work becomes a way of collaborating with God and caring for creation. Your relationships become laboratories for learning how to love more generously and forgive more completely. Your difficulties become invitations to trust more deeply in God's goodness and provision. Your joys become glimpses of the abundant life that God desires for all people. As we conclude this reflection on divine warnings and Ignatian discernment, I want to leave you with an image that captures the essence of what it means to live in responsive relationship with God's guidance. Imagine yourself as a skilled sailor who has learned to read the subtle signs of wind and weather that indicate when conditions are changing. You do not sail in fear of storms, but you have developed the sensitivity to recognize when the winds are shifting and the wisdom to adjust your course accordingly. This is what it looks like to live according to Ignatian principles of discernment. You become attuned to the gentle movements of God's Spirit in your life, responsive to the warnings and invitations that arrive through your deepest feelings and most authentic desires. The restlessness you have been feeling, the sense that something in your life needs to change, the persistent questions about whether you are living according to your deepest values and highest calling. These are not sources of anxiety to be suppressed. They are invitations to a more authentic and fulfilling way of life. They are God's way of warning you that you might be settling for less than the abundant life you were created to enjoy. The divine voice that spoke to Ignatius in his moments of deepest questioning is the same voice that is speaking to you right now through this very message. If this exploration of Ignatian spirituality has touched something deep in your heart, if you sense that God might indeed be trying to get your attention about something important in your life, I invite you to join our community of seekers who are committed to living according to divine guidance. By subscribing to this channel, you will receive regular teachings and practical exercises designed to help you develop your own capacity for spiritual discernment. Each video offers tools for recognizing God's presence in the midst of your ordinary life and guidance for responding courageously to the divine invitations that are constantly being offered to your heart. You are not alone in this journey of learning to listen to God's voice. Many of us are discovering together how to live with greater authenticity, purpose, and joy by paying attention to the movements of the Spirit within our everyday experiences. Thank you for opening your heart to these reflections. Your willingness to consider that God might be speaking directly to you through your deepest longings and most persistent questions is itself a sign of the grace that is already at work in your life. The question that remains is simple, but life-changing. What is God trying to tell you right now? What warning or invitation has been persistent in your heart that you have been avoiding or dismissing? What would it look like to take the first small step in the direction that your deepest wisdom has been pointing? These questions are not meant to create anxiety, but to open you to the adventure of living in conscious partnership with the divine love that has been guiding your life all along. Stop. Listen. God is speaking. Your heart already knows what it needs to hear.